The Bloodline's Echo. The house stood on a bluff overlooking a forgotten stretch of coastline, a monument to an ancestral line that seemed to have forgotten the art of letting go. Its stone foundation, perpetually slick with sea spray and the slow creep of moss, anchored it to a landscape as desolate as a sigh. Emily Carter had inherited it, not as a gift, but a burden, a sprawling, skeletal structure that breathed the chill of generations. Every floorboard groaned a different age, every window pane wept condensation, and the air itself carried the faint, metallic scent of something long settled, like old copper or congealed iron. Her life here was one of deliberate routine, a bulwark against the inherent gloom that seeped from the very walls. She was an archivist by profession, accustomed to deciphering the faded scripts of the past, but the script of this house was proving far more cryptic, far more insistent. It began subtly, as all insidious things do. A shade too dark, a silence too profound, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. Emily first noticed it in the study, a room she'd meticulously cleared of her great-aunt's hoarded ephemera, intending to transform it into her own workspace. She'd been polishing the dark oak floorboards, their surface reflecting the gray light of a perpetually overcast sky, when her cloth snagged. She knelt, her knees protesting the cold, and ran a finger over the spot. It wasn't a splinter, nor a scratch. It was a stain, a dark Venus red, the color of dried blood on old linoleum seeped into the grain of the wood. It was no larger than her thumbnail, an irregular bloom that seemed to have materialized from within the wood itself. Emily frowned, pressing harder with her thumb. It was dry to the touch, almost a part of the floor. She grabbed a damp cloth, scrubbing with a vigor born of mild annoyance. The stain remained, stubbornly unmoved, merely spreading a faint, greasy sheen across the polished oak. She tried a stronger cleaner, then a harsher one. Nothing. The crimson mark persisted, a tiny, defiant eye staring up from the polished wood. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, traced its way down Emily's spine. She'd meticulously cleaned these floors just weeks ago. Every inch had been scoured, every imperfection noted. This stain, she was certain, had not been there. She told herself it was a chemical reaction, some obscure interaction between the old wood and her cleaning solution, perhaps a hidden knot in the grain finally revealing itself. But the color, it was too specific, too unsettling. She covered it with a small braided rug, dismissing it with a forced logic that did little to quiet the nascent unease stirring within her. Days bled into weeks, each one a subtle deepening of the house's oppressive atmosphere. The rug in the study became a focal point of Emily's peripheral vision, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. She found herself glancing at it, a morbid curiosity compelling her to occasionally lift a corner, only to confirm the stain's steadfast presence. Then she started seeing them elsewhere, faint, almost imperceptible smudges of that same troubling hue, on the edge of a kitchen tile, a fleeting shadow on the white porcelain of the bathtub, a dark blush on the pale wallpaper in the hallway. Each time she'd scrub, she'd rationalize, she'd attempt to wipe away the creeping dread, but the stains, or the memory of them, always lingered. The whispers began around the same time, or perhaps they had always been there, merely coalescing into coherence. At first, they were indistinct, a vague auditory distortion that Emily attributed to the house settling, the wind rattling loose panes, or the distant sigh of the ocean. The house was old, after all, and prone to its own mournful music. But then, during a particularly still evening, as the last vestiges of twilight bled from the sky, she heard it, a sound, thin as spun glass, yet resonant with an ancient weariness, emanating from the wall beside her bed. It was a woman's voice, barely a murmur, a breath exhaled into the dust motes of the air, but it was there, and it spoke her name. Emily.
The sound was so faint, so delicate, that she immediately doubted her own hearing. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The house was silent again, save for the rhythmic creak of the old timbers responding to the cooling night air. She strained her ears, listening to the oppressive stillness. Nothing, just the slow, deliberate thrum of her own blood. She tried to dismiss it as a dream fragment, a phantom auditory echo from her subconscious. But the clarity of it, the distinct articulation of her name, clawed at the edges of her reason. The whispers became more frequent, more insistent. They were never loud, never demanding, always just on the cusp of full audibility, forcing her to question if she was truly hearing them or merely anticipating them. They came from behind the plaster, from beneath the floorboards, from the hollow spaces within the house's very bones. Sometimes it was just the single drawn-out utterance of her name, like a lament. Other times it was a fragmented syllable, a half-formed word that evaporated before she could grasp its meaning. The voice was always the same, low, feminine, imbued with an unbearable sorrow and an underlying current of something cold and sharp. Emily began to sleep with a lamp on, its weak glow doing little to dispel the shadows that danced in her peripheral vision. She found herself moving through the house with a heightened sense of awareness, her ears perpetually pricked, her breath held. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a prison, its walls pressing in, its unseen inhabitants restless. The final disruption to her carefully constructed reality came with the photographs. Emily had arranged a small gallery on the mantelpiece in the living room, a collection of sepia-toned portraits, faded tintypes, and more recent, though still antique, framed snapshots of her family line. There was her stern-faced great-grandmother, a woman whose gaze seemed to pierce through the veil of time. Her great-aunt, a softer, almost ethereal presence, and a scattering of distant relatives, their faces indistinct with age and poor photography. One morning, as she brewed her tea, she noticed it. The photograph of her great-grandmother, which had always stood resolutely in the center, was now askew, pushed slightly to the left. In its place, perfectly centered, was a smaller, more obscure image, a group shot of stiff, unsmiling figures from the late 19th century, their faces blurred with time, their eyes like dark smudges. Emily remembered this photograph tucked away in a dusty album, rarely displayed. She was certain she had not placed it there. A knot tightened in her stomach. She approached the mantelpiece, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. With a trembling hand, she picked up the photo, examining the back. No adhesive, no discernible reason for it to have moved. She carefully rearranged the gallery, placing her great-grandmother back in her rightful spot, the obscure group photo relegated to its former, less prominent position. She convinced herself it was a draft, a slight tremor in the old house, a fluke. But the next morning, the same arrangement had returned. The blurred faces of the unknown ancestors stared out from the center, her great-grandmother relegated to the side. And this time, other photographs had shifted too. A small oval portrait of a young woman with startlingly pale eyes, a distant cousin Emily barely recognized, had been turned to face the wall. Another, of her grandfather as a child, was placed upside down. This was no draft. This was deliberate. Emily felt a cold dread unfurl in her chest, a creeping certainty that her rational explanations were fraying, dissolving into the improbable. The stains, the whispers, the photographs, they were not isolated incidents, but threads in a tapestry of unsettling intent. The house was no longer merely old, it was alive with something that wished to communicate, or perhaps to claim. She spent the following nights in a fitful, shallow sleep, plagued by fragmented images and the relentless murmur of the unseen voice. The house felt colder, heavier, its oppressive silence punctuated by the spectral whispers that now seemed to weave themselves into the very fabric of her dreams. She would wake with a jolt, her body slick with a cold sweat, her ears straining for the sound that had pierced her sleep. Sometimes she thought she saw movement in the deepest shadows, a fleeting distortion of the air, a sense of eyes watching her from the impenetrable gloom. Emily began to feel an awful presence, not just in the house, but of the house. It was a suffocating weight, a pressure on her chest that made breathing a conscious effort. The metallic scent in the air seemed to intensify, growing richer, almost visceral. She found herself checking locks twice, peering into corners before entering a room, her heart quickening with an irrational fear that something would materialize from the shadows. Her solitude, once cherished, now felt like a terrifying vulnerability, a solitary boat adrift on an ocean of the unknown.
The house was no longer just her home. It was a vast, echoing chamber, and she was trapped within its unsettling hum, a captive audience to its slow, deliberate unveiling of horror. The creeping unease had ripened into a profound dread, and Emily knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was only the beginning. Part 2. The relentless hum of dread that had settled into Emily's chest only deepened with each passing day, twisting into a tighter, more suffocating knot. The house, once a vast echo chamber, now felt like a living entity, its unseen organs atrophying, its breath growing shallow and cold. The metallic scent, once faint, now permeated every room, clinging to her clothes, her skin, a coppery tang on her tongue that made her perpetually thirsty. The stains proliferated, blooming like malignant fungi on the aged surfaces. What had begun as a thumb-sized mark in the study had become a network of crimson veins snaking across floorboards, weeping from the seams of wallpaper, and bleeding into the porous grout of the bathroom tiles. They were no longer mere stains, they were wounds, weeping openly, a grotesque map of the house's internal affliction. Emily stopped trying to scrub them away. Her efforts were futile, merely spreading a thin, greasy film that made the color seem even more vibrant, more defiant. She started to avoid looking directly at them, her gaze skimming past, yet her mind registered every new dark bloom. The whispers, too, amplified their insidious reach. They were no longer confined to the walls around her bed. Now they slithered from the antique radio she never played, hissed from the forgotten registers of the defunct heating system, and sighed from the empty fireplace. Emily. The sound was no longer just a name. It carried an undertone of ancient grievance. Sometimes it coalesced into fractured phrases she couldn't quite grasp, like words spoken underwater, but their tone was unmistakable, mournful, vengeful, utterly devoid of warmth. She began to respond, whispering, "Who's there?" into the oppressive silence, her voice brittle with fear, only to be met by a chilling stillness that felt heavier than any sound. The photographs on the mantelpiece became a nightly ritual of torment. Every morning, Emily would find them rearranged, not subtly now, but violently. Her great-grandmother's portrait would be face down, its glass cracked. The obscure group photo, the one with the blurred faces, would be propped defiantly in the center, sometimes splattered with a dark, viscous liquid that smelled faintly of salt and iron. Once, she found all the frames empty, the sepia images strewn across the floor, ripped in places as if a spectral hand had gripped them in a fit of rage. She would spend agonizing minutes carefully reassembling them, her fingers trembling, only to find the chaos renewed by dawn. It was a deliberate, mocking act, a constant reminder that her control over her own space, her own sanity, was dissolving.
Her sleep, already a fractured landscape of dread, became a shallow, dangerous precipice. She drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by the sensation of something hovering just beyond the veil of her eyelids, a cold breath on her skin, a heavy presence in the room. One particularly suffocating night, she woke to the distinct feeling of being watched. Her eyes, heavy with exhaustion, struggled to open. The room was plunged into the deepest possible darkness, the lamp she usually kept on having flickered out. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound came from above her, a dry, scuttling noise that made the hair on her arms stand on end. She lay paralyzed, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening to the sound. It was coming from the ceiling, a rhythmic scrape, scrape, drag, like brittle nails on old plaster. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to rationalize it as a rat, a branch against the roof, anything but what her terrified imagination was conjuring. But the sound was too deliberate, too heavy for a rodent, too internal for the wind. Finally, a suffocating need to know, however horrific the truth, forced her eyes open. The moonlight, thin and sickly, filtered through the grimy window pane, casting faint, shifting shadows. And then she saw it. Crawling across her ceiling, upside down, like a grotesque inverted spider, was a figure. It was undeniably female, but disfigured, impossibly gaunt, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles. Its long, dark hair hung in ragged clumps, trailing like seaweed, almost brushing the ceiling in places, then swaying with each agonizing movement. Its face, when it slowly turned towards her, was a mask of utter horror, a hollowed-out expanse where eyes should have been, replaced by two gaping, shadowed pits. Its jaw was slack, twisted, a silent scream frozen in place. And everywhere, clinging to its skeletal frame, was the dark, viscous crimson that had become the signature of the house. It wasn't blood actively flowing, but rather a congealed, matin residue, making its form appear perpetually soaked in gore. It moved with a sickening, jerking motion, its long, bony fingers splayed wide, digging into the plaster with each scrape, leaving faint trails of disturbed dust. It didn't speak, but a low, guttural moan seemed to emanate from its very being, a sound of profound suffering and ancient rage that vibrated through the floorboards, through her very bones. Its head tilted, slowly, impossibly, fixing those empty, shadowed sockets on Emily. She felt a cold, paralyzing terror seize her, rooting her to the bed. Her breath hitched, caught in her throat, a scream stillborn. The creature was impossibly close now, its tattered form almost directly above her, the stench of stale blood and decay washing over her. Then, with a shuddering, violent spasm, it dropped, not fully, but just enough for its outstretched skeletal arm to dangle inches from her face, its fingers twitching, beckoning, reaching. Emily let out a strangled gasp, a sound torn from the deepest part of her fear. The creature paused, its twisted head cocked, as if listening to her terror. And then, with another sickening lurch, it began to retract, scuttling backward across the ceiling, faster now, until it disappeared into the deepest shadow near the far wall, leaving behind only the faintest echo of that scratching sound and an indelible image burned into Emily's retina. She didn't sleep again that night. She sat huddled, back against the headboard, a heavy quilt pulled up to her chin, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for it to return. The sun eventually rose, casting a weak gray light into the room, banishing the deepest shadows, but doing nothing to dispel the memory of what she had seen. The encounter left her physically and emotionally shattered. She moved through the house in a daze, every shadow a potential hiding place, every creak a prelude to a horrifying reappearance.
The whispers were no longer just whispers, they seemed to emanate directly from the air around her, sometimes coalescing into a cacophony of overlapping, mournful laments that made her hands clamp over her ears. She tried to leave, to escape the suffocating grip of the house. She packed a small bag, her hands shaking, her mind screaming for freedom. But as she reached the front door, a profound, unshakable inertia seized her. It was as if the very air thickened, growing heavy and dense, pushing her back, whispering, "Stay," from every pore of the old wood. She couldn't bring herself to turn the handle, to step outside. A terrifying sense of belonging, a horrifying magnetic pull, kept her bound to the house. It was the morning after her failed attempt to flee that Emily discovered the markings. She woke with a searing ache in her left wrist, a dull throb that had been absent when she had finally drifted into a tormented sleep hours before. Groggily, she pushed back the sleeve of her nightshirt. Her breath hitched in her throat, a cold shock seizing her. Carved into the pale skin of her inner wrist were 3 distinct symbols. They were crude, jagged, etched deeply enough to break the surface of the skin, leaving raised, angry red lines. The cuts were fresh, still weeping tiny beads of crimson, stark against her pallor. They formed a sequence, a downward-pointing triangle, bisected by a wavy line, then a circle with a single elongated dash through its center, and finally a crude, 3-pronged fork like a trident. They were unmistakably ritualistic, ancient, and utterly alien. Emily stared, her mind reeling, struggling to process the impossible. She had gone to bed alone, her skin unblemished. There was no knife, no sharp object on her nightstand, nothing she could have used. The implications were staggering, horrifying. Someone had entered her room, had held her down, had carved into her flesh while she lay unconscious. It was a violation so profound, so intimate, that it transcended all previous terrors. The horror was no longer confined to the house's atmosphere or fleeting apparitions. It had become deeply, horrifyingly personal. It was etched into her very flesh. A wave of nausea washed over her. She stumbled into the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face, trying to scrub away the lingering sense of violation. But the marks remained, raw and accusing, a permanent brand. She tried to clean them, to disinfect them, but her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the antiseptic. As she stared at her reflection, a gaunt, terrified stranger staring back, the mirror began to weep. It started subtly, a single dark tear seeping from the top left corner of the antique, silver-plated frame. It was a rich, Venus red, the exact shade of the stains on the floor, the residue on the creature's body, the fresh cuts on her wrist. The tear slowly thickened, growing in volume, trickling down the ornate silver, gathering speed. Then another appeared, and another, until a steady stream of dark, viscous liquid was oozing from the frame, running down the glass, distorting her already fractured reflection into a blurry, crimson-streaked nightmare. It wasn't watery like blood, but thick, almost oily, clinging to the glass, leaving dark trails that glistened wetly. The metallic tang in the air intensified, becoming almost unbearable, like standing in a slaughterhouse. Emily recoiled, pressing herself against the opposite wall, her eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. The mirror, her own reflection, was bleeding. The house was not merely haunted, it was bleeding into her reality, forcing her to confront its monstrous truth with every fiber of her being. The ritual markings on her wrist pulsed with a dull ache, a sickening counterpoint to the weeping mirror, a horrifying realization dawning in her mind. The house, the spirit, and now her body were inextricably linked in a dance of escalating terror. This was not just a haunting, it was a reclamation, and she, Emily Carter, was its chosen canvas.
The bleeding mirror shattered Emily's last vestiges of sanity, splintering her world into jagged shards of terror.
The ritual marks on her wrist, a livid testament to an unspeakable violation, throbbed with a persistent ache that echoed the relentless pounding in her skull. The metallic tang in the air, now a constant, suffocating presence, made her gag, her throat raw from the effort. She no longer slept. She merely existed in a state of hypervigilance, every shadow a threat, every silence a prelude to some new horror. The house had become a living tomb, its walls pulsating with a malevolent energy. The crimson stains proliferated beyond all reason, forming intricate vein-like patterns across every surface, as if the house itself was hemorrhaging. They coalesced into grotesque shapes, sometimes resembling distorted faces, sometimes ancient symbols that mirrored the ones carved into her flesh. The whispers no longer merely called her name. They formed a discordant chorus, a wailing lament interspersed with sharp, guttural pronouncements she could almost, but never quite understand. They spoke of blood, of debt, of reclamation. Emily found herself drawn involuntarily to the study. It was as if an invisible thread pulled her toward the room where the first stain had appeared, where the haunting had begun its insidious creep. The oak floorboards, once so meticulously polished, were now almost entirely obscured by a vast, sprawling map of dark red. In the center, where the small rug had once been, the crimson was deepest, almost black, and glistening wetly, as if freshly spilled. As she stepped into the room, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of old iron and something else, something cloying and sweet, like decaying flowers. The whispers intensified, swirling around her, pressing in from all sides, a cacophony of spectral voices. She returns, the blood calls, the debt is due. Her gaze fell upon the wall opposite the fireplace, a section she had always overlooked, covered by a heavy tapestry depicting a faded hunting scene. Now, the tapestry seemed to ripple, to breathe. Driven by an instinct she couldn't comprehend, Emily reached out, her fingers trembling, and pulled it aside. Beneath, etched into the plaster, was a mural. It was faded, obscured by centuries of dust and neglect, but undeniably present, crude, ancient, and disturbing. It depicted a circle of figures, cloaked and hooded, their faces indistinct, gathered around a central altar. Upon the altar lay a prostrate form, undeniably female, her limbs splayed, her head thrown back in what could have been either agony or ecstasy. Surrounding this central image were symbols etched deep into the plaster, symbols that sent a chill of recognition through Emily's blood. They were identical to the ones carved into her wrist, the downward-pointing triangle, the bisected circle, the three-pronged fork. A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a narrative, a terrifying story unfolding, and she was, unwillingly, its central character. The whispers sharpened, coalescing into a single dominant voice, raw and filled with ancient pain. They bound me, trapped me, for generations. Emily stumbled backward, gasping for air, her mind reeling. The mural, the symbols, the whispers, they painted a terrifying picture, one that reached back through the forgotten annals of her family, her ancestors. They had performed some dark ritual, some unspeakable act, binding a spirit, trapping it. And now, after generations, it was returning. The realization settled like a block of ice in her chest. This was not random, not just a lingering presence. This was a targeted vengeance, a generational debt coming due. And she, Emily Carter, was the latest living iteration of the Bloodline.
A guttural growl, not of the whispers, but of something far more physical, reverberated through the floorboards. The crimson stain in the center of the room began to bubble, to churn, a sickening, viscous froth rising to the surface. Emily stood frozen, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. The stench of decay intensified, burning her nostrils. From the churning, blood-like pool, a form began to rise. Slowly, agonizingly, it coalesced, forming first a hand, skeletal and dripping, then an arm, then a shoulder. It was the creature from her ceiling, but magnified, solidified, horribly real. It pulled itself from the crimson morass, its movements jerky and unnatural, its gaunt frame perpetually coated in the same viscous, dark red substance. Its hair, long and matted, hung like wet ropes, clinging to its twisted face. Its eyes were no longer just hollowed-out pits.
Now they glowed with a faint, malevolent light, 2 pinpricks of pure, incandescent hatred that fixed on Emily. Its jaw, still slack and dislocated, slowly began to move, a horrifying creaking sound, as if old bones were grinding together. A voice, raw and rasping, tore from its throat, a sound that scraped against Emily's soul. You, the blood, the vessel. It took a step towards her, its bare, clawed feet making squelching sounds in the wet, crimson floor. Its body was a testament to unimaginable suffering. Limbs twisted, flesh torn in places, revealing sinew and bone. It was not merely disfigured, it was mutilated, a walking, breathing monument to agony, sustained by pure, unadulterated vengeance. The stench of it was overpowering, a miasma of blood, rot, and something profoundly ancient and evil. My prison, your ancestors, they stole my freedom. Its voice was a low growl, punctuated by wet, rattling breaths. They bound me for generations, blood for blood. Emily tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. The air crackled with a palpable energy, a suffocating aura of malevolence that pressed down on her, stealing her breath. The creature was closer now, its grotesque face looming, its glowing eyes burning into hers. She could see the intricate details of its suffering, the lacerations on its skin, the dried, dark blood matted into its hair, the impossible angles of its bones. It was a vision of pure, unadulterated horror, a nightmare made flesh. It raised one of its skeletal, dripping hands, its long, sharp nails black with what she knew was congealed blood. It reached for her, slowly, deliberately, its gaze never leaving hers. Emily could feel the icy cold emanating from it, the sheer weight of its ancient rage. She wanted to flee, to run screaming from the house, but she was trapped, held captive by a terror that transcended the physical. Its fingers brushed her cheek, leaving a cold, wet trail. The touch was like ice, searing her skin. The whispers around them intensified, a whirlwind of voices screaming, "Reclaim! Reclaim!" Then, with a sudden, violent movement, the spirit gripped her arm, its clawed fingers digging into her flesh, exactly where the ritual marks had been carved. A searing pain shot through her, agonizing, electric, as if molten lead was being poured into her veins. Emily finally found her voice, a raw, guttural scream torn from her very depths. The spirit pulled her closer, its face mere inches from hers, its glowing eyes boring into her soul. The binding weakens, the blood calls, the vessel awaits. Its voice echoed not just in the room, but in her very mind, a chilling invasion. As it spoke, Emily felt a sickening sensation, a profound shift within her own body.
It was as if something cold and alien was seeping into her, intertwining with her own essence, replacing her warmth with its ancient chill. She could feel the ritual marks on her wrist burning, not just from the spirit's grip, but from within, as if they were coming alive. The world around her began to blur, the room dissolving into a swirling vortex of crimson and shadow. The screams caught in her throat, morphing into something else, something deeper, more guttural, a sound that felt alien on her own tongue. She felt her muscles spasm, her body twisting in ways it shouldn't, mirroring the spirit's contorted form. The spirit's grip tightened, its face pressing closer, its breath, cold and smelling of graves, ghosting over her lips. "Join me, become me, the bloodline continues." And then, a new sensation, horrifying and undeniable, a profound hunger, an ancient violent craving that was not her own, stirring within her. It was a hunger for vengeance, for blood, for the reclamation of a long-lost power. It was the spirit's hunger, now hers, pulsing in her veins. The last thing Emily saw before the darkness consumed her was the spirit's face, no longer purely a mask of rage, but now tinged with a horrifying satisfaction. Its glowing eyes reflecting her own terror, and something else, a shared, unholy light. The sensation of cold, ancient energy flooding her body intensified, overwhelming her, as if her very being was being stretched, reshaped, prepared. The house around them screamed, not with the wind, but with a chorus of liberated, vengeful spirits, their cries echoing the spirit's chilling promise, "The vessel awaits." And Emily knew, with a certainty that transcended fear, that the transformation had begun, and her own essence was slowly being consumed, replaced by the terrifying echo of the bloodline's forgotten debt. The horror had moved beyond the house. It was now within her, dormant but awakening. Part 4. The darkness that consumed Emily was not the merciful void of unconsciousness, but a living, suffocating entity. It was a plunge into a realm beyond her comprehension, a maelstrom of raw, ancient emotions that tore at the edges of her being. She existed as a fragmented consciousness, witnessing horrors from within, a prisoner in her own skull. Images flashed, violent and disturbing, forgotten rituals performed by cloaked figures in a moonless glade, the terrified screams of a young woman, bound and struggling, and then the excruciating agony of being ripped from her body, bound and forced into a timeless, suffocating captivity. These were not her memories, yet they played out with the terrifying clarity of her own experiences, each surge of pain, each wave of despair registering within her. When Emily finally clawed her way back to a semblance of awareness, it was not with a gentle awakening, but with a violent jolt. She lay sprawled on the crimson-soaked floor of the study, the metallic tang of blood thick in her throat, her muscles aching with an unfamiliar soreness. The ritual marks on her left wrist burned, throbbing with a deep internal heat. But it was the cold that truly pierced her, a profound, ancient chill that had settled deep within her bones, a cold that felt as if it had been there for centuries. She pushed herself up, her limbs stiff and uncooperative. The study was still a grotesque tableau of horror, the floor still slick with the viscous, blood-like substance. But the mutilated spirit was gone. Only the churning, dark pool in the center of the room remained, slowly receding, like a tide pulling back to reveal the ravaged shore. Emily looked down at her hands. They were pale, almost translucent, and on her fingertips, beneath the nails, she noticed faint traces of dried, dark red. A wave of nausea, more intense than any she had experienced before, twisted her stomach. Had she touched it? Had she been part of the gruesome tableau, a participant rather than a victim? The thought was a sickening, unwelcome intrusion. She stumbled to the nearest mirror, a small, ornate-looking glass in the hallway that had mercifully been spared the weeping blood. Her reflection stared back, gaunt and wild-eyed, but something was different. Her eyes, usually a soft, earthy brown, now seemed darker, deeper, with an unsettling sheen that caught the ambient light in an unnatural way. And the chill, it radiated from her, a palpable aura that made the very air around her seem to drop in temperature. The house, too, felt subtly changed. The pervasive dread was still there, but it was no longer a terror directed at her. Instead, it felt like a part of her, an extension of the coldness that now resided within. The whispers were softer, less accusatory, more like an internal monologue, a chorus of voices within her own mind, echoing the ancient lamentations and the thirst for vengeance. She spent the next few days in a horrifying trance, moving through the house like a phantom. She ate little, slept less, her body a vessel for a consciousness that was not entirely her own. The ritual marks on her wrist, instead of healing, deepened, the skin around them taking on a waxy, almost translucent quality, as if they were becoming a permanent part of her essence. She found herself drawn to the mural in the study, staring at the crude depiction of the ancient binding, a strange sense of recognition stirring within her. She knew this story, not from memory, but from a deeper, more primal understanding. The violent urges began insidiously, a fleeting desire to smash something, to tear at the ancient wallpaper, to inflict pain. She fought them, terrified of what she was becoming, but the urges were persistent, growing stronger with each passing hour, whispering promises of power, of retribution. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, painting the windows in hues of bruised purple and bleeding orange, Emily found herself in the master bedroom. The air was colder here, the metallic scent sharper. She walked to the large antique armoire, its dark wood scarred by time, and opened its heavy doors. Inside, draped over a wooden hanger, was a dress. It was old, impossibly old, a garment of dark, heavy fabric that seemed to absorb the light. It was stained in places, not with the new viscous crimson of the house, but with the faded, ancient rust of old blood, dried and brittle. The cut was archaic, a simple, shapeless gown, but it exuded a palpable aura of sorrow and violence. Emily didn't remember ever seeing it before. It hung there, waiting. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, ran through her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough fabric. It was cold to the touch, and yet a strange warmth, a sense of familiarity bloomed within her. The whispers surged, 1,000 voices speaking as one, echoing in her mind, the raiment for the reclaiming. She slipped the dress on. It was loose, flowing, the heavy fabric clinging to her skin with a strange intimacy. As it settled around her, Emily felt another profound shift. The chill within her intensified, but it was no longer merely cold. It was a potent, focused energy, a surging tide of ancient power. Her vision sharpened, the shadows in the room no longer simply shadows, but active entities, coalescing, whispering to her. The house hummed with a newfound vibrancy, no longer a tomb, but a crucible, a stage for the final act. She walked to the large, full-length mirror, the one that had wept blood. It was clean now, its surface pristine, reflecting her image with an unsettling clarity. She stared at herself, at the woman in the ancient, blood-stained dress. Her eyes, now undeniably darker, seemed to glow with a faint internal light. Her face, though still her own, had a new severity, a sharp, almost predatory edge. She looked like a ghost, a vengeful spirit herself. As she watched, a faint crimson glow emanated from the ritual marks on her wrist, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat. The glow spread, seeping into the veins of her forearm, tracing faint, luminous lines beneath her pale skin, like a grotesque internal network of power.
It pulsed up her arm, into her shoulder, her neck, a slow, terrifying invasion. Then she heard it. Not the whispers, not the moans, but a distinct, feminine laugh, low and chilling, echoing in the silent room. It was not her laugh. It was the spirit's, and it resonated from within her own throat. Emily gasped, pressing her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror and a growing, terrifying fascination. The laugh came again, a sound of triumph and vindication, and this time she felt her lips curve into an answering smile, a smile that was not her own, a smile filled with cold, ancient malice. She took a step closer to the mirror, mesmerized by the transformation. The faint crimson glow beneath her skin intensified, painting her in an unholy light. She felt her body grow taut, her muscles thrumming with an unfamiliar strength. The hunger, the craving for vengeance intensified, eclipsing all other emotions, becoming the dominant force within her. And then, a memory, not her own, but undeniably hers now, flooded her mind. It was a memory of the binding, of the betrayal, of the centuries of imprisonment. It was a memory of the faces of her ancestors, those who had trapped the spirit, their fear and avarice clear even through the haze of time. And with that memory came a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, directed at the very bloodline she carried. Emily raised her hands, watching the crimson light pulse beneath her skin. Her fingers, once soft and delicate, now seemed to lengthen, to sharpen, an ancient power swirling within them. She felt a profound connection to the house, to the land, to the very elements, a connection that had been severed for generations and was now, through her, being violently re-established. The whispers in her mind had ceased their lament. Now they were a unified voice, a chorus of triumph, speaking not of sorrow, but of liberation, of retribution, of a reckoning. The vessel is ready, the time is now. A violent tremor shook the house, not an old house settling, but a profound seismic shift of power. The air around Emily crackled, the shadows in the room deepening, swirling, becoming almost solid. She felt an uncontrollable urge, a primal need to inflict, to repay, to reclaim. Her blood, her very essence, was no longer her own. It was a conduit, a vessel filled with the vengeance of a wronged entity. Her reflection in the mirror seemed to ripple, the boundaries between Emily and the spirit blurring, dissolving. The ancient dress clung to her, a second skin, imbuing her with its ancient sorrow and rage. She saw the ghost of the mutilated spirit hovering just behind her reflection, its glowing eyes fixed on hers, a horrifying fusion taking place. Emily was no longer just Emily Carter. She was the echo of an ancient wrong, a living embodiment of vengeance. The transformation was nearly complete. The final stage was upon her, and with it the terrifying knowledge that the horror had not ended with the spirit's return. It had merely found a new form, a new voice, a new instrument of retribution, and that instrument was her. The house, the bloodline, the spirit, and now Emily were one, poised on the precipice of an unleashed ancient fury. Part 5. The final chilling laugh that resonated from Emily's own throat was the last gasp of her former self. It was a sound of profound triumph, yes, but also of a terrible, echoing emptiness, as if her soul had been scooped out and replaced by a roaring gale of ancient rage. The crimson glow beneath her skin pulsed, faster now, a violent internal lightning that mapped out a new network of power, usurping her veins, her nerves, her very consciousness. The house trembled in sympathy, no longer a passive structure, but a living, breathing extension of the entity now inhabiting Emily.
plaster cracked, dust motes danced in the air like frantic spirits, and the metallic tang of blood intensified, rich and visceral, a taste Emily now found comforting. Her reflection in the mirror solidified, the blurring lines between her and the mutilated spirit dissolving into a horrifying singularity. The woman staring back was Emily, undeniably so, yet her eyes burned with an alien light, an ancient malevolence that had nothing to do with her gentle, archiving self. Her lips, once soft, were now set in a thin, cruel line, and the subtle shift in her posture, the way she held her head, spoke of a primal, predatory awareness. The ancient dress, a dark shroud, seemed to cling to her with a possessive intimacy, its faded bloodstains now vibrant, almost luminous. The whispers in her mind, once a cacophony of fragmented voices, now fused into a single, resonant chorus, a unified will that was both hers and not hers. It spoke of betrayal, of generations of imprisonment, of a profound and searing injustice. It spoke of ancestors who had wielded forbidden knowledge, twisting ancient rituals, not to banish, but to bind, to siphon, to contain a power they could not comprehend for their own fleeting gain. And now the binding was broken, the vessel was prepared, the reclamation had begun. Emily felt an irresistible pull, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated from the very foundations of the house. It was not a physical force, but a spiritual magnetic north, drawing her towards a forgotten truth. She moved, not with her own hesitant steps, but with a fluidity, a purpose that was entirely new. Her bare feet, cold and stark against the floorboards, no longer registered the chill. She felt no fatigue, no fear, only an escalating, focused hunger. The journey led her back to the study, to the mural, which now seemed to glow with a faint internal light. The crude figures, the prostrate woman on the altar, they came alive in her mind, not as faded paint, but as vivid, searing memories. She stood before it, her hand raised, and with a touch, the plaster dissolved, revealing not another wall, but a hidden passageway, cloaked in profound darkness and smelling of damp earth and stagnant air. This was it, the true heart of the binding. She descended into the darkness, her steps echoing hollowly. The air grew colder, heavier, charged with an ancient energy. The passage, narrow and winding, led her deep beneath the house, past rough-hewn stone walls weeping with centuries of moisture. The whispers in her mind grew louder, a triumphant roar now, punctuated by the rhythmic pounding of her own heart, which felt less like a life-giver and more like a drum of war. Finally, the passage opened into a vast, cavernous chamber. It was circular, its walls rough, unworked stone, converging to a domed ceiling from which thin, sickly roots dangled like desiccated nerves. In the very center, illuminated by an unseen, phosphorescent moss that clung to the damp walls, stood an altar. It was a crude, monolithic block of unpolished stone, stained dark with age and something else, something Emily now recognized as dried blood, eons old. Upon the altar lay a single decaying object. It was a doll, crafted from what looked like knotted roots and dried mud, its features indistinct, but its form undeniably feminine. It was impaled through its chest by a splintered bone-white shard and wrapped tightly in intricate bindings of hair and sinew. This was no child's toy. This was the focus of the ancient ritual, the anchor of the spirit's captivity. As Emily approached the altar, the ritual marks on her wrist burned with an unbearable intensity. The crimson glow beneath her skin pulsed violently, mirroring the throbbing heart of the room. The whispers reached a crescendo, a single guttural chant echoing in her mind. "Break the binds, shatter the cage, reclaim the essence." With a newfound strength, Emily raised her hands. Her fingers, still her own, but imbued with an alien power, reached for the root doll. As her touch connected, a shockwave of energy ripped through the chamber, making the very stone groan. The phosphorescent moss flared, casting grotesque, shifting shadows. She gripped the doll, her fingers tightening around the brittle bindings. The bone shard impaling it seemed to glow with a malevolent, resisting light. The spirit within her surged, a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated vengeance, demanding release. With a primal scream that was both Emily's and the spirit's, a sound that tore through the ancient stone chamber, she ripped the bone shard from the doll. The bindings, dried and ancient, snapped and crumbled in her grip, disintegrating into dust. As the doll shattered, a torrent of dark, viscous energy erupted from it, swirling around Emily, enveloping her. It was cold, yet searing, agony and ecstasy intertwined. She felt her body convulse, her muscles twisting and contorting as if fighting an invisible force. Her bones groaned, her flesh stretched, her mind screamed as the last vestiges of Emily Carter were overwritten, consumed, absorbed. The chamber filled with an unholy light, crimson and black, pulsating with a terrifying power. The roots dangling from the ceiling writhed, the very earth trembling. When the light finally receded, slowly, reluctantly, silence descended once more, thick and suffocating. Emily stood at the altar, but it was not Emily. Her form was largely unchanged, still clad in the ancient dress, but her eyes, now fully luminous, burned with a cold, ancient intelligence that had nothing to do with human understanding. Her skin, once pale, had a subtle, almost imperceptible translucence, as if light passed through her. The ritual marks on her wrist were no longer merely glowing, they were etched in pure, crimson light, a permanent, terrifying brand of her new identity. She reached out, her hand no longer trembling. The root doll, now a pile of dust and fragments, lay on the altar. With a gesture, the dust swirled, reforming, not into the doll, but into a small, intricate symbol on the stone surface, the three-pronged fork glowing with an internal crimson light. It was a new mark, a mark of power, a mark of her. A deep, resonant laugh, born of centuries of waiting, of suffering, of vengeance, rumbled in her chest. It was the same laugh she had heard earlier, but now it was whole, complete, utterly her own. It was a sound that promised retribution, not just for the past, but for the future. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the ancient chamber, no longer seeing stone walls, but the very fabric of time, the echoes of generations. The house above, which had once imprisoned her, now felt like a mere extension of her will, a sentinel guarding her awakening. With deliberate steps, she walked back through the hidden passage, emerging into the study. The mural was gone, the wall restored to its plain plaster, as if the ancient binding had never been. The crimson stains on the floor had vanished, replaced by the original polished oak, gleaming innocently in the muted light. The house was cleansed, not of the haunting, but of the evidence of its past. The spirit had not merely possessed Emily, it had absorbed her, transmuted her, and in doing so had rewritten the history of the house itself. She walked to the front door, the very door that had once refused to open for Emily Carter. This time, she simply placed her hand on the cold brass knob. It turned effortlessly, silently. The sea air, cold and bracing, washed over her, carrying the faint tang of salt and distant decay. She stepped out onto the weathered porch and gazed out at the desolate coastline. The sky was an endless expanse of bruised purples and grays reflecting the turbulent ocean. Her eyes, luminous and ancient, scanned the horizon, not for freedom, but for a new purpose. A faint whisper, carried on the wind, seemed to emanate from the very air around her. The bloodline, not ended, but renewed. Emily smiled then, a slow, chilling curve of her lips that revealed a profound and terrifying satisfaction. The hunger was still there, the ancient craving, but it was no longer a torment. It was a driving force, a clear, irresistible directive. She was the vessel, yes, but she was also the entity, the culmination of centuries of raw power and unfulfilled vengeance. She was not merely transforming into the next vessel. She was the vessel, the spirit, and the curse itself, unbound and free, ready to reclaim her bloodline, not just by haunting, but by becoming its new terrifying architect. The cycle had not broken, it had merely evolved, and Emily Carter was merely the chrysalis from which something far older, far more terrible had emerged, hungry for the future. The house stood silent behind her, a tomb now, awaiting her return, or perhaps awaiting her next victim. The bloodline's echo had found its voice, and it was Emily's. And it was just beginning.